Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library. My name is Janie Herman, and I am the manager of adult programming. It's my great pleasure to introduce briefly our author and moderator for tonight's conversation. They're over here. They're going to have a formal introduction in just a moment. Please note that this room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-coil technology. If you need hearing assistance, we do have T-coil enabled headphones for your use. We kindly ask that you silence electronic devices during the talk and that you hold your questions till the end, as there will be a chance for audience question and answer after the end of the discussion. So tonight's event is being held in partnership with Labyrinth Books. And the library and Labyrinth Books work together closely throughout the year to curate our author events, and it's been a great privilege to work with Dorothea and her staff to bring authors to our community, both as individual institutions and together cooperatively when it makes sense, like tonight. I'd also like to thank the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton University's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, and SPIA in New Jersey for their co-sponsorship of tonight's event. So tonight we are here to discuss Everyday Utopia, what 2,000 years of wild experiments can teach us about the good life. And so I'd like to turn the microphone over now to Joris Van Wolkte to do the introduction of our guests.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to everybody here for coming out, and of course from Labyrinth Books as well. Thank you to the library for hosting this, and for you both for being here tonight. As already mentioned, my name is Joris. I'm a bookseller at Labyrinth, and I'm really very excited to get to do a little introduction here to get this event started. The conversation tonight is on a topic that is as relevant today as it's ever been. It's on utopias, their potential for a politics of possibility, and the real examples that show why striving for a different future is not just a realistic endeavor, but perhaps even a prerequisite for all change. In Everyday Utopia, what 2,000 years of wild experiments can teach us about the good life, Professor Kristen Ghodsee presents us with a sweeping history of utopias, both realized and imagined. She's professor for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and among many other books, is the critically acclaimed author of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence. Her scholarship shows us how to avoid the cynicism we might feel in our day-to-day lives, and argues for an expansion of the political imagination to rethink the most basic and seemingly natural aspects of our everyday. In her new book, Professor Ghodsee's History of Utopian Thinking focuses in large part on one of the core units of our lives, the family. Through examples of ways in which our intimate interactions with others can change the relationships of care within our community at large, Ghodsee provides for us a key to one of the simplest but also most complicated insights, namely that the way things are is not how they must be. The real examples in this book are constant reminders that in order to live differently, we must not let the common dismissal of all utopian thinking as wishful thinking keep us from conjuring and then fighting for a better, different world. And who better to bring into this conversation tonight than Joan Scott, who in this town needs little introduction. However, I'll try my best to keep it brief. Her books include Gender and the Politics of History and On the Judgment of History, which are both for sale here tonight. When I first encountered her texts, they unlocked for me an understanding of what ideology means and how it can function to make the present seem justified, the real unquestionable, and how this can keep us precisely from imagining that everything could be otherwise. Kristen Ghodsee's book continues this education in the stakes of political imagination through rigorous scholarship with a personal touch. Her book shows us that while the world we hope for may always be just out of reach, the islands we stop at along the way have much to teach us about how we can live differently today. Please help me in welcoming Kristen Ghodsee and Joan Scott.
Thank you. I guess I'm supposed to ask you questions, Kristen.
That's right. I think so, yeah.
So the first question is for you to tell this audience, most of whom we hope will buy the book, but who haven't read it, a little bit about what's in the book. And then I have a list here of a few questions to kind of push you on about
Sure.
what's in there.
Yeah, so I mean, the basic idea of the text is to really interrogate the way we organize our domestic lives. And part of this emerges from some realizations during the pandemic that when the lockdowns occurred and people were suddenly forced to kind of shelter in place in their single-family homes with their immediate families, that was really unsatisfying for people, especially if they had young children at home. And there was an attempt immediately to form what were called pandemic pods, where people were sharing childcare and homeschooling. There was an attempt to create some sort of mutual aid society so that people living in neighborhoods could buy groceries maybe for older neighbors or do things, share resources with each other. So there was this sort of moment where people started to interrogate, like, why do we live the way we do? And for me, I was also, locked down like everybody else was, and thinking about, wow, why am I living this way? What is going on in the world that this container, really quite literally the box of my house, the four walls within which I am now contained, how did I get here? So I started really thinking about the way that Western societies, or not even just Western, but I would say industrialized societies primarily in the global North, have idealized a particular set of domestic relationships. And those domestic relationships primarily look like this. They look like a romantic couple, traditionally heterosexual, but not necessarily, who provides exclusive biparental care for their own biological offspring, sometimes adopted, but usually biological, in a single family home, surrounded by lots and lots of their own privately owned stuff. And that model, if you're a young person in the world, and you're trying to move out of your parents' house and you want to start a life and get your own place and start your own family, that's what people aspire to. That is the hegemonic way in which we imagine the appropriate container for child rearing and family making. And yet, it's of such recent vintage. It is absolutely incongruous with our longer evolutionary biological history of cooperative breeding, of evolutionary anthropological history, of being much more capacious in the way that we think of both kin, which is a word that we all know, but there's also this other wonderful word, kith, right? If you remember the term kith and kin. Kith is an archaic Old English word that literally means those who we know who are not necessarily our blood relations. And if we go back and look at the historical record, and in this book I start with the Pythagoreans and I work my way through all sorts of different historical examples and different cross-cultural examples, there have always been people who have looked at mainstream society, who have looked at the way that we do things, quote unquote, normally or naturally, and have said, this isn't working for us. We're gonna go off and we're gonna do something different for a certain specific set of reasons, and those reasons vary, but we're gonna do it differently because we think that living in more capacious and connected communities of love and care and support are gonna allow us to do things that we might not otherwise be able to do if we were only thinking about our own nuclear families and sort of perpetuating a particular cycle of intergenerational transfer of wealth and privilege. And that experiment, let's say, of the Pythagoreans, which then influences Plato, which then influences people like Thomas More and Tommaso Campanella, and then finds its way through Fourier and the Saint-Simonians and on through all sorts of different communities up until the present day, because the book contains a lot of very present day examples. It teaches us something about the creativity, flexibility, and adaptability of human species, and how wonderfully weird we are when it comes to creating social and emotional networks in order to survive different environmental, climatic, political, economic circumstances. And so the book is really a call for us to remember this history of utopianism, this history of these social dreamers that go way, way, way back, deep into antiquity and certainly even deeper into prehistory. And to find ways to sort of pull from those different experiments, different aspects of the way that people were organizing their lives to help us survive and thrive in the 21st century.
Okay.
That's the basic gist.
Here it is. Okay, so I'll start with the historian's question.
Sure.
I'm the historian. So there's one of the things about this book that's really quite impressive is the extensive range of sources that you use. You could say that it's Pythagoras or Plato to Star Trek. And that's what the range of these utopian alternatives to what we think of as the necessary family organization of our domestic lives. So, but I kept thinking, what are the limits to that? If you go, I mean, you're covering 2,000 years, as it says on the cover of the book, of wild experiments. Aren't they different in different periods? Don't they need to be thought in their context rather than as lessons for us in the present? How do you, I mean, she's trained as an anthropologist, I'm trained as a historian, so mine is the historian's question about how you pull all of these things out to make an argument for the present that doesn't quite take account of the specificities of the moments in which these utopian experiments are thought.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think that that's a really important question because it gets to, I think in some ways, a difference between our disciplines.
Which I don't think these people want to hear about.
Yeah, you don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of that. But I do think that, look, you know, as a social scientist, to a certain extent, I cast a net, and you know, and to be fair, this is a commercial trade book. So that means that where an academic book would have depth, a book like this necessarily has breadth, meaning that like it has to cover a lot more information with a lot less detail because, let's face it, nobody wants to read 4,000 pages of the history of utopianism. I mean, some of us do, but most of us don't, right?
Well, you did for the book.
Yeah, for the book, right? But the point is that so what do you have to do? You have to look back and you have to say, okay, what do all of these different experiments cross-culturally and trans-historically have in common? What are the things that you know, it's like that, if you grew up maybe in the United States or you're familiar with Sesame Street, you remember that one of these things is not like the other? Yeah? So there's this wonderful way in which you think, okay, what are the things that are like the other? And what you find over and over again in different religious traditions, in different historical epochs, in different ethnic contexts, in different political movements, is a desire to live in a particular way that is beyond what anthropologists will call consanguineous bonds, so beyond just blood relations. And so one of the things that I do in this book is I go all the way back 9,000 years ago to Neolithic Çatalhöyük, which is a contemporary archaeological site in what is today's Turkey. And archaeologists are looking at this site, and what they're realizing, partially because of the advent of genetic testing, is that this archaeological, sort of proto-city, this place, first of all, doesn't show us any evidence of hierarchies. Nobody has a dwelling that's bigger than anybody else. When we look at nutritional evidence, we see that children, men, women, people in this community had basically the same access to nutrition and calories. So there aren't big differences in the way that people are consuming food or drink or nutrition. But what's really fascinating, if you ask me, is that in Çatalhöyük, which is essentially like a big city, and all of the individual dwellings are of the same size, they're all interconnected, and you go into the dwelling through a hole in the roof, a ladder into the dwelling, and the collective roofs of Çatalhöyük, it's like the big living room of the community. So everybody hangs out on these roofs. But within the individual dwellings, there is a hearth where people cook their food and stay warm in the winter. And there are bones that are buried underneath the hearth. And when archaeologists go in and they excavate those bones, they're particularly interested in dental records. And they can look at dental records and they can do this genetic testing. And most contemporary archaeologists assumed, not surprisingly, that people who were buried together at the same time in the hearth would be family members. It turns out they weren't. They were not related to each other by blood, which means that 9,000 years ago, our ancestors had a completely different idea of kinship than who you happen to be related to because of your biological affinity. And if we start to take that idea and then we look at it in all sorts of different contexts, you look at Buddhists, you look at early pre-325 Christians, you look at the Essenes in Judea between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD. There are all sorts of groups that are organizing themselves in non-consanguineous groups. And then you pull that thread and you realize that anarchists and socialists and feminists and environmentalists and all sorts of different groups of people for different reasons, they end up on the same sort of basic general idea. To me, that tells you something. I don't know exactly what it tells you, right? Because I'm not gonna say it means that this is natural or not natural. Anthropologists are not in the business of saying that. But the fact that it has persisted for so long, and that different utopian groups, sometimes self-identified, sometimes called utopian from the outside, that they keep there's like a centrifugal force that keeps pushing them towards a sort of similar way of being in the world, of raising children together in bigger communities, of sharing their property, of building dwellings that are interconnected. Something about that must be important. And it must be fundamental to our history as a species. And so again, I think there's a difference between our disciplines. For me, why does it persist? Why are there still intentional communities in rural Virginia? Why are there eco-villages in southern Portugal? Why are there places that are literally replicating these ways of being in the world that most of us now think is kind of weird? Right? I mean, they're kind of weird. They're strange. And yet they persist, and they continue to persist.
Yeah. And that's really one of the arguments, the important arguments of your book. But now I want to move from the general and the sort of large-scale examples of utopian behavior in communities to the more personal things. Because another of the interesting things about this book is the way in which you use personal anecdotes to illustrate your points. There are points where there are the discussions of the kind you just summarized for us, and there are other points where you tell us a story about what happened, what you were taught in school, and what teachers did or did not offer. And one of my favorite examples is the one in which you talk about you and your daughter sharing clothes as an example of a kind of, you call it the socialism of the wardrobe, I think. And so can you talk a little bit about that, about maybe not so much that example per se, but the way in which you strung these personal stories through this scholarly account. It's not scholarly, as you said. It's not laden with footnotes and endless abstract arguments, but it is a set of examples of historical attempts to create alternative families and communities. But then you have all of this personal stuff. How did you decide when to tell personal stories and how to bring that in? And I have to say, I found it works really well. Just when you're getting to the point where you think, I don't want to read about another French utopian community in the middle of wherever, you get to a kind of anecdotal set of examples drawn from your personal life. So can you talk a little bit about that piece of it?
Yeah, so I think that this is also a deliberate sort of rhetorical choice that comes from writing for a more mainstream type publisher. So I think when I write as a writer, sometimes my process is I need to write my way into an argument. You know, a lot of times there's like throat clearing that happens. Like I have to like think through whatever's going on in my mind before I actually say something substantive. And a really good editor will tell you, okay, cut the first 90 pages of this because it's totally irrelevant. Everything gets started around page 90. And you know, and you know, this is the kill your darlings kind of moment where you're like, no, I wrote 90 pages. How could I let that go? Interestingly, in the case of this book, and again, I think this is also particularly because it was during the pandemic, I felt like I had to excavate my own experiences. I lived, you know, maybe a little bit of a non-traditional life, and certainly that comes through, I think, a little bit in the book. And it was helpful for me to think through the ways in which I might have done things differently than my peers, or certainly my age cohort. I'm a Gen Xer. And I wrote all of that stuff sort of with the intention of like cutting it out, right? Like it was my process. You know, anybody who writes knows that you write a lot more than ever makes it into the final text. And in the case of this book, I had a very weird situation in which I had 2 editors, and then one of my editors went on parental leave, and I got a 3rd editor. So and they were all very different in their experiences and in their expectations. And so I was trying to please 3 different editors at the same time. And one of those editors, and I'm really grateful for this, said, leave the personal stuff in. The personal stuff gives us an avenue into understanding why these historical examples are so important. And it was something that in some ways I had to accommodate myself to, but in the end I do think it was the right decision.
I do too.
Yeah.
I think, and those of you who read the book will find this, that as I just said, when you're getting to a point where you're just like, okay, tell me a little more, you give us a story. I mean, the example of sharing clothes with your daughter was one of the ones that it made me laugh, but it also made me understand the point you were trying to make about not owning things, property not being a highly individualized personal item.
Right. I mean, there are all sorts of examples, I think, where some, you know, when you hear the word utopia, it often sounds like, oh, you know, you're automatically going to some kind of weird intentional community where everybody owns everything in common and people are raising their children collectively or something like that. But sometimes when you just think about the fact that you share things with your romantic partner, or you share things with your children in a way that you just don't even question, you know, like your daughter might plunge into your closet and say, hey, can I borrow this jacket from like 1986 that you bought with all of your saved money? And you're like, no, I don't want you to have that because like it meant so much to me 30, 40 years ago. And then you think, no, but it's okay, like good. It's finding a way into the world. It's creating a kind of connection. And yet if like some stranger, or even worse, like, you know, even somebody like some other kid, like a friend of my daughter came and said, hey, can I borrow that jacket that you patiently saved up for in 1986? I would be like, right? So why the difference? Why do I feel that difference? Why is it okay for me to share with my daughter, but not okay for me to share with one of my daughter's friends? And that kind of thought experiment, to me, shows me the limits of the way in which we think about family and property, right? Because we all understand that if you move in with a roommate, let's say you're sharing a flat in New York or whatever, that you can have like different shelves in the refrigerator, right? Or you pay the utilities out of separate bank accounts. But if you're like living with your own kids, or you're living with a romantic partner, even a new romantic partner, the last thing that you want to do is be like, this is my shelf, and this is your shelf in the refrigerator, and like, don't you dare eat my yogurt, because, right, the whole point of being in a romantic relationship or in a relationship of closeness is that you share things. That's sort of like how we kind of mark our connection to each other. So if we do that, even if we do it hesitantly with our romantic partners, why don't we do it more? It shows us the limits of our thinking. And so sometimes I feel like, at least for me, and I know this as a reader as well as a writer, that occasionally we can get deep into a theoretical argument, but that sometimes just a simple story, it tells you everything that you need to know without all of the baggage of the theoretical argument behind it. The story gives us the insight that we need to understand our own limitations.
And I think that editor was right, because it works to make the book accessible in a way that it otherwise might have been. Okay, moving on, because we have a lot of ground to cover. So on the family, as we've said, is the target of the book, right? And on page 219, you make a very provocative set of arguments, which is, and I'll just, on 218 you say, what if we could somehow separate out our mating practices from our child-rearing practices, to think creatively about how we might arrange our private lives to maximize the amount of love, care, and support both we and our children could enjoy. And then you go on to say, what we need to do is separate sex from family.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could, and sex from child rearing, so that child rearing could become a kind of communal thing. Sex would be a separate sort of issues, and they needn't occur in the same heterosexual marriage that they usually do.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely spend a lot of time in the book, and there are two chapters that really sort of give you not only like the evolutionary anthropology, but the evolutionary biology. I go into primatology. There's all sorts of concrete information about how did we get to a point where we believe that the romantic relationship between two people, and again, primarily historically heterosexual, is the appropriate container for parenthood, when in fact, we are, as a species, cooperative breeders. And cooperative breeding, may sound really kind of weird, but all that means is that grandparents are really important, especially grandmothers. And we know this. It also means that older siblings, prepubescent siblings, are extremely important because, I don't want to bore you, but like humans are very different from other primates in that we have our babies essentially premature, so they have a much longer period where they're dependent. And secondly, we have our babies much closer together. Most other primates do not have another baby until the first baby is completely weaned and independent. We have babies in very rapid succession, which means that exclusive biparental care is completely inefficient. Exclusive biparental care is not enough to deal with the caloric provisioning needs of our babies if we're without, in the absence of birth control, if we're having a bunch of kids. So we have always evolved these other ways. Grandmothers, turns out, extremely important. We are, a lot of people may not realize this, but we are one of the very few mammalian species where women live past senescence, right? The fact that women are postmenopausal, most other mammalian species, you die when you are no longer able to have children. But human women and orcas, whales, go figure, right? Orcas, orca grandmothers, and we have really, really great data on orcas. Orca, if you're an orca baby and you have an orca grandma, you have a much higher rate of survival than if you don't have an orca grandma. Orca whales live past senescence, as do humans. And there are all sorts of wonderful arguments, people like Sarah Hrdy, Mothers and others, that talk about how important this cooperative breeding. Hrdy and her colleagues basically argue that human cognition, language, religion, the nation state, all of that derives from cooperative breeding. That because we raised children in common, because our babies have big heads and they're born premature and we have to provision them, that because we had to develop language, right? Like, I'm gonna stay here and nurse the baby, you go over there and get some berries, right? We needed to be able to communicate. So there's this very complicated argument, and there are all sorts of different permutations about this. But at the end of the day, I think what's so interesting about the family, right, is that human beings as a species are probably the most important thing about us is that we're flexible, that we're adaptive, and that we're creative. Yeah? And when environmental or geographic or climatic or economic or political circumstances change, we rearrange our family forms, right? So if there's a war and a whole bunch of men die, wow, suddenly we have the situation of polyandry, right? Where you might have a woman, the other way, polygamy, right? But then if you have like selective sex abortion, where you have very few women, suddenly you start to see polyandry, so that you have multiple women with, I'm getting this all mixed up. Polyandry is one woman with multiple husbands. Polygyny is one man with multiple wives. And we also have a long history of celibacy. People who just decide not to have romantic relationships, and they live in non-consanguineous communities, particularly monks, nuns, different kinds of monastic communities, but they always take children in. They often take in orphans, they often take in children who are unwanted for one reason or the other because they're born out of wedlock or whatever. So these people raise children. And so every single point in the historical spectrum, in every single culture, we have examples of people who are not in a romantic relationship who are raising children. So what does that tell us? That tells us that these things are separable. And the fact that we today think that the appropriate and perhaps only container for childbearing is the romantic relationship is like a weird artifact of our contemporary society. And I go on in the book to argue that the reason we have this particular form is precisely to maintain very high levels of inequality. So there's an argument on the other end of that. But the provocation that you just read is that these things are separable. I'm not saying anything that isn't patently obvious to people in evolutionary anthropology or in the history of human mating practices, because we know even today that there are many societies that are still polygamous, and there are many societies or subsets of society that are celibate, and then they still have kids, and they have kids, and they raise those kids, and those kids go on, and the human race survives.
Okay, so I know we want to leave time for questions too, and I have just two more questions. So one is, provocative that you are, and you can see just from listening to Kristen talk how provocative she is. You have another thing when you're talking about education in schools. And I want to just read what you say because it's so relevant to the politics of now, right? The hysteria and hypocrisy surrounding the politics of school curricula reflect a clear reality. the fight for our collective future will inevitably be fought in our classrooms. I mean, this is the link you're making between how the social change that you're looking to inspire or to ask us to think about comes about. Although many parents are exhausted by the culture wars being fought at the level of individual school districts, it's a mistake to think we can return to some non-ideological place of just teaching basic subject matter and nothing else. There is no value-neutral way of educating citizens. As Plato understood so well over 2 millennia ago, a society's virtues are taught through public education, and all of us have a stake in determining which virtues we wish to prioritize. And then comes the provocation. Such an important task cannot be left to parents alone.
Yeah. I mean, look, those of you who are parents, and those of you who or have helped parent children, even if you're not parents yourselves, you know that young children, that teenagers, that young adults, they need so much in the way of guidance, in the way of help and support and emotional care to get through what is, I mean, especially these days, a very complicated and kind of depressing, apocalyptic world that we're living in right now. I mean, I lived 15 years in Maine, and I can't tell you right now the level of anxiety that I'm just feeling because of what's happening. Not to mention everything else that's going on in the world, right? So why do we think that the task of raising healthy, well-adjusted, happy, fulfilled adults, the next generation, is just the responsibility of 2 biological parents who may not be particularly well trained, right, to do that job? I mean, many people go into parenthood quite deliberately, but so many people stumble into parenthood inadvertently, and suddenly you are the lodestar of another human being's life. Of course we want help. And I think that teachers and coaches and, you know, pastors and colleagues and religious people in our community, neighbors, there's so many different adults. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily a progressive argument, right? Because I think in many conservative traditions, you have things like godparents. You know, you have people in the community who provide support and guidance for children and support parents, right? So this isn't, I mean, you say it's provocative, right? But all of us have had a teacher or a professor or a coach, you know, or a rabbi or an imam or a priest who guided us or helped us in a moment of need. And yeah, it would be great if our parents were like perfect human beings who could always say the right thing, and always, by the way, say it in the right way, because you might be saying the right thing, but apparently you could say it in the wrong way.
Always.
Always. And you know, but we are human beings, and so I think that it's so important to recognize that systems of education, going all the way back to Plato, right? And there's a whole utopian thread around the importance of public education. Public education isn't indoctrinating our children. Public education is supporting parents in their job to raise a next generation that is not utterly despondent and despairing of the future.
But you say it's a mistake to think we can return to some non-ideological place of just teaching basic subject matter. There's no value neutral way. So there is a set of values
of course
you are looking to inculcate and to have communicated.
But think about it. When you tell kids not to cheat on their tests, you're inculcating the value of honesty. When you tell kids not to bully other kids, you're inculcating the value of being nice. You know, when you tell kids not to steal, or when you tell kids, you know, not to use ChatGPT on their papers, or whatever, right? I mean, whatever thing, this is not about you should think X, Y, or Z. I mean, most of us across the political spectrum, we don't like cheaters, we don't like bullies, we don't like selfish jerks, right? I think that's those are values.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when Plato in 375 BC says that women can be guardians and that they should have the same access to education as men, that is a value. Now, it's not I think that's a really important value, but it is a value. And so when I say value neutral, like there's no way of going back, I think it's because we have to have a much more capacious understanding of values. It's not that you should, have X opinion on particular X political issue today. We're talking about being a decent human being, of not giving into despair, of not being mean to people, of not being selfish, of not being, somehow, this is going to sound corny, but I do think that there's a spirit of generosity and connection and love that we're afraid to touch in schools, right? Because it feels too personal. And yet, look at classes at Yale. This woman who teaches the class on the good life. 400 people enrolled in that class, and 600 people were on the waiting list. And what was that class about? It was a class about what is it like, how do you live a good life? At Harvard, Michael Sandel teaches justice, and he's been teaching that class forever, thousands of people. It's one of the most popular classes at Harvard. Why? Because people want to know, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to stand for justice? Now, that's going to be politically complicated, I understand. But at its core, these are values that I think we all appreciate. And the last thing I'll say is, Robert Waldinger, who's the current director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is this wonderful longitudinal study that shows very clearly what people value in their lives over the long durée. And what is the most important thing? Relationships. Our connections to each other, our connections to other people. So I think that insight, that's across the political spectrum.
Okay, so this is that leads me to my last question.
Okay.
Which is that I think one of the things that's interesting about the book is the reporting to us over this long historical period of collective attempts to live alternatives to what you're calling the sort of domestic nuclear family. And yet, as you're doing now, there's lots of examples where you're talking about individual choices that can or cannot make a difference. I heard that in what you just said to us, and you say at one point, of course, there will always be a high social cost associated with living outside of the mainstream and of organizing our private lives in ways that flaunt the expectations of our parents, friends, colleagues, and neighbors. It's hard to be different. But it turns out that many of us would live less stressful, healthier, more equitable, and sustainable lives in communal domestic organization arrangements, and so on and so forth. So there, for me, in reading this, there was this tension between the kind of radical optimism that utopias represent, which is for social transformation of an important kind, and the choices that individuals might or should, according to you, make to live outside the mainstream, as if that in itself might realize some of these utopian dreams. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that, because that for me was not a limit of the book, but an interesting tension to watch you think in the book.
And it's interesting that you bring this up, because I'm just, as I said earlier to you tonight, I'm writing the preface to the paperback, which is coming out. And one of the things, I've been on book tour, and I've been around the United States, and I've been in the UK and Belgium and Germany, and talked to a lot of people. And one of the things that's really shocking or eye-opening to me is how many people have come up to me and said, but we're already doing this. It's already happening. I'm already living this way. I'm already doing things, and it doesn't necessarily show up in the data. So, there was a I was telling you, the British guy and two of his friends, they bought row houses next to each other, and then they knocked down the walls between their gardens so they could all kind of hang out in a shared garden. And that's not going to show up in the data because it's going to show up as 3 different families buying single-family homes, and nobody knows what they're doing in their gardens behind their homes. So here's the thing, and I think a lot about this because I also teach a class at Penn on demography. And what we know is across the world, and we talked about this earlier this evening, there are many young people who are just deciding not to have children. They're saying, no, the environmental situation is so dire, I'm so economically precarious, or I just don't have enough belief in the future that I cannot conscionably bring children into this world. And so individual people are making aggregate decisions, they're making individual decisions that are then aggregating into massive demographic decline across the industrialized North. And so there's no ideology attached to that. It's like, no, it's too hard to have kids, and so I'm just not going to do it. The interesting thing for me about that argument is that they're thinking of having children in this particular box of the single family, the heterosexual biparental care, the single family home surrounded by hordes of their private stuff. And they're saying, I can't afford a house, I can't afford all that stuff, I don't have a partner, I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to do all of this, and so I'm just not going to do it. But what they're not thinking is, what if I did this differently? What if I got together with 6 of my friends and we decided to raise a couple of kids in common, and we shared a house and we shared our stuff? And so I think that unlike my previous work, where I really did spend a lot of time thinking about policy level solutions. And I still am, I think at heart, a kind of policy person. I think there are things that our governments in a democratic society could and should do to make parenting easier. Certainly things like universal subsidized or free childcare, certain things like universal health insurance. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which we could live in societies with much more robust social safety nets. But in the absence of the state, in the absence of states that are responding to us, and I think a lot of young people today feel like states are not responding. I mean, just look at gun control. What can we do in our own lives? What decisions can we make? And it is not easy to live outside the mainstream. And in fact, I wrote an article for romper.com about tri-parenting, and I interviewed a colleague of mine who's a professor at Yale, who was in a formal tri-parenting relationship. He was one of 3 legal parents. And he was very happy, and it was a great arrangement. But at the end of the day, he didn't want his name used in the article because it's still so far out of the mainstream that he didn't want to be named. And so I think that what's happening is that a lot of people are making choices about ways of living in the world that they're not necessarily willing to own up to yet, but it's happening. And it's happening. And so that tension that you identified is a really important tension, because and it's a limitation of my book, which is that for me, utopian movements were identifiable. Like if I look at the pre-325 Christian communities, or the Essenes, right, or the early Buddhist communities, they had like a specific plan, a way of being in the world, and they were persecuted, and bad things happened, and that they persevered, and they survived, right? And if you look at Christianity and Buddhism, they survived really well, right? So much so that they're now like kind of conservative forces in the world. But it never occurred to me, I mean, I'm not saying that it never occurred to me, but I think it's really interesting that if I was a Christian in, let's say, 100 AD, that I might not necessarily be thinking of myself as a utopian. That I would be living with like a bunch of people and like hiding from the Romans or whatever, and there was an ideology that was really speaking to me, and I had these beliefs, but I didn't necessarily think that what I was doing was so radical, right? I wasn't like a Pythagorean or something. Like those people were really weird. Like we were just doing something different. So it could be that like the way that we're living right now the people that are making these tiny little decisions in their private lives that don't feel necessarily radical, like you kind of know that it's a little out of the mainstream, and I've talked to so many people who will show me pictures on their phones of their friendship commitment ceremonies, or their platonic parenting arrangements, or their mommunes. Like, the great thing about being on a book tour for a book like this is that people come out of the woodwork and they want to tell you their stories about how they're doing things differently. All the people who lived on kibbutzim, or the people who are in intentional communities or eco-villages. And yet, when I say, they'll say, well, but we're not utopians. Like, we are not, like those people are utopians, but we are not utopians. But it's like, but wait, like kind of there's a thread here. So I think that the most important lesson in some ways is that there's always been a small sliver of society in all historical epochs and across cultures of people who make a conscious decision to live differently. And we kind of make fun of them, and we kind of might think that they're weird, and like sometimes we smash them, like the Albigensians or the Bogomils or the Essenes. But somehow their ideas, their ways of being in the world, when things start to get hard, we kind of think, well, maybe we could do some of that. Maybe we could pull some of that into our lives. And maybe by doing that, that adaptability and flexibility and creativity that I talked about of the human race, maybe part of that comes from always allowing there to be this sort of weird utopian fringe, so that utopia is on the horizon. Most of us aren't going to live in an intentional community and raise our kids cooperatively with a bunch of non-consanguineous adults. But we might take our kids to daycare, which is a kind of a walking back of that radical Platonic vision from Book 5 of the Republic, right? So at the end of the day, it means that there's hope. And in a moment of despair, I really feel like hope is so important. And where we find hope is often in those margins.
Which makes you the greatest utopian of them all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
Thank you. Okay, so we have time for a few questions here. Does anybody have any questions? I mean, it's been so fascinating. Oh, gonna make me run all the way to the back.
Hi. Thank you for coming. So throughout this whole talk, I was actually like waiting for you to say like exactly what you said at the end. Like, most of us are not gonna like live in these like idyllic communities. Like, when obviously I don't have kids, but like when I like imagine like where my life might be like 10, 15 years from now, like it will probably more or less look like a sort of like what we think of as like a normal American like home and family style, whatever. But these like principles that you speak to, I like find really attractive. These ideas of like communal support and sort of like having like a more robust like community to be a part of socially as well. And I'm curious if you could, you mentioned it very briefly with like daycare, but I'm curious if you could speak to ways in which you like concretely imagine these ideals integrating themselves into the lives of people who do not choose to take the like full plunge into like utopian living or tri-parenting or something like that.
Yeah, so that's basically what the book is about. And I talk about things like co-housing, and I talk about things like co-living, and I talk about things like multi-parenting, states which allow a child to have more than 2 legal parents, right? And obviously this is really important in families where there are step-parents. This is really important where grandparents are primary caretakers of children. This is also important in queer relationships where you might have sperm donors or egg donors or surrogates. With mitochondrial replacement therapy, you can literally have 2 biological mothers and 1 biological father. So I spend a lot of time in the book describing the extremes and then walking them back and saying, okay, so what is happening right now? So I was on the phone this morning with a journalist who was talking about she's got a book coming out called Other Significant Others, and she's talking a lot about friendships and the ways in which we tend to prioritize, especially in the United States, romantic relationships over friendships. And she's really trying to think, what would it mean if we centered friendship as a kind of like primary focus of our lives, and we lived near our friends, and we owned property with our friends, and we raised children with our friends. And that can look kind of timid, right? It might literally be that you're just like living next door to your best friend, and maybe you share a car, or you share, like the example that she was giving of people, of friends who live next to each other, was they had separate cars, but if one of their car broke down, which they did, they could like walk across the street or walk next door and like borrow a car from a friend, right? So the thing about these utopian ideals, and the thing about thinking about them as this sort of long historical chain of ways of being in the world that are different, is that you don't have to buy the whole package, right? You can take little bits and pieces of it and apply it to your own life. And so, yeah, a lot of us may end up in what look like very traditional kind of nuclear families, but there are things that you can start to do on the margins of that. It could be sharing a snowblower, it could be sharing a lawnmower, it could be swapping chores, or having regular daycare or babysitting nights, right? That start to kind of like chip away at the isolation of the nuclear family, because there are 4 things in the book that I'm targeting. The first is isolation and loneliness. The second is vast levels of inequality. The third is the crisis of care for the young and the elderly. And the fourth is environmental costs of living in single-family homes when we're all individually heating and cooling our homes on a planet where extremes of weather are going to make the cost of heating and cooling more expensive and more intensive to the environment. And we know, this is like not rocket science. If more people are living in a home that's being heated and cooled, they're all benefiting from the heating and the cooling, rather than heating and cooling lots of different individual abodes. So there are actual things directly that making these small marginal changes, and again, they can be coordinated, but they don't have to be coordinated. They can be happening spontaneously. And they can be happening for financial reasons, ecological reasons. They could be happening for, wanting to feel more connected in terms of aging in place or aging near communities. So I want to leave open the possibility, and I think this is a really important point, is that most of us aren't going to live this way, but that there are parts of this model that we can pull into the present. Because from an evolutionary anthropological point of view, if we think of our domestic arrangements as being creative, flexible, and adaptive to the environment and to the societies within which we live, then as our environment and our societies change, our domestic arrangements will change. And that can happen in lots of different ways, but it will happen. And so it may be that in 10 years, if you're living in a nuclear family, you might be a minority, right? You don't know. Things could change really fast.
Interesting.
Yeah, hi, you painted a very idealistic picture of communal living, et cetera, et cetera. How does people like David Koresh and Jim Jones
Yeah.
and the extreme Mormons fit into the way you're thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I get this question all the time. Like, what's the difference between intentional community and a cult? Believe me, many people have asked me that. And so I would say 2 things. First, in any one of these communities, you have to be free to leave. You have to be able to go, right? If it's not working, there's a door and you use it. And the second thing is, I think there's a real importance of what I would call charismatic leaders. Most of these communities do not have a charismatic leader that is like the person who says, we are now living in utopia, and this is how it's going to be. All of the utopias that I studied, and I study a lot in the book, one of the things the ones that last are the ones that are flexible and changeable, because there's no really one person in charge. And if it starts with a person in charge, that person gives up authority. And that's very, very clear. Or, they die. and then their followers sort of like try to figure out like how to make it work. But where you have a charismatic leader and you have an involuntary set of people who are not able to leave, then you're definitely in cult territory. And I think that's important. And I think that one of the biggest resistances in this country is precisely the cult, right? People fear that, like, if your kids go off and live in an intentional community or something like that, that they're joining a cult of some kind. And I think that's a story that's fed to us because we also don't want people to live cooperatively. But it's also based on a very historical reality, that there are these sort of weird cults of personality and that you can easily be seduced into a particular way of living that's very rigid. But as long as the community remains flexible and open, I don't think you run that risk. And again, there are lots of examples where those communities remain open and people cycle in and out, and they don't necessarily have like a leader, so to speak.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there for the evening. We're at the top of our hour.
Sorry.
That's okay. We lots of time to stay and talk and chat. And we have books over here for signing from Labyrinth Books, so you can make your way over there. We have lots of copies. Get yourself a copy and be sure to read this book. And thank you both for a wonderful and engaging conversation. It was really eye-opening. Thank you.
Thank you.